What Ralph just said makes me think immediately that when I joined General Powell in Atlanta in 1989, when he was head of the Army's largest command, the so-called Forces Command in Atlanta, and then 5.5 months later moved up to Washington to be his special assistant when he was selected by George H.W. Bush to be chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. And we went through Operation Just Cause, Panama, the invasion of Panama, and then Operation Desert Shield, Desert Storm, the first war in Iraq. It never crossed my mind for a second that I'd be sitting at a podium with Ralph Nader. Or for that matter, Bruce behind or Mike. Mike and I, by the way, sit together sometimes on another committee that tries to look out after our civil liberties and so forth underneath the Constitution Project. So I know him and I know his views a little bit. There is a remarkable coincidence, nonetheless, between the views of the people who are sitting at this table right now about the state of our republic. I tell my students at both the George Washington University and William & Mary, I ask them, where is it written on stone that unlike any other empire in 5,000 years of human history, where is it written on stone that the American empire will not expire? And aren't all the signs legion today that we are indeed expiring? And aren't the times so accelerated in terms of how fast history moves, if you will, that unlike Rome, for example, that lingered in the East, in Constantinople and elsewhere for a long time, we may not linger. It may be quite a catastrophic breakup. We had a Welsh parliamentarian at William & Mary in the Department of Government, 26 years in the Welsh Parliament, talking to us about the United Kingdom the other day. And he was telling us there's a 60-40 chance, 64, that the UK will break up in the next 20 years. There will be a Wales, there will be a Scotland, there will be an England, and there will be a reunited Republic of Ireland. The interesting thing he told us was this was not because of the very aggressive independence movement in Scotland. It was not so much because of the truly economic success that Wales has had, or because of the apparent end of the Troubles. It was because the English were getting sick and tired of passing their money to other states without any representation in their own parliament. Because if you think about it, they don't have a parliament except the parliament at Westminster. Could that happen to the United States? You're damn well right, it could happen. That we could actually break up. I've just come back from out west. People out there don't think about 9/11 the way we think about 9/11 back here on the East Coast. In fact, the message I got most in places like Coeur d'Alene, Idaho, Boise, Idaho, Colson, Washington, Seattle, Washington even, was, why are you guys so hung up on that crap? That's a good sign that maybe a little resilience might be returning to our country. Resilience meaning we lose more people on the highways than we did in 9/11. We lose more people on the highways than we've lost in all the terrorist attacks ever on us in history. Overreaction? You bet. Bin Laden spent about $500,000 to commit that tragedy in New York and against the Pentagon and in that field in Pennsylvania. And we have spent conservatively $2 trillion trying to counter him, and I think more if you look at the entire budget across the entire national security spectrum, intelligence included, which is now up to around $90 billion, and tell me what we get for it. It's probably more like $4 trillion. As Eisenhower said in his famous Cross of Iron speech, that's humanity hanging upon a cross of iron. That is not a life in any sense of the word. And then he went on to detail how many modern hospitals could be built for the price of a single bomb. How many public schools, modern and well-equipped, could be built for the price of a single Navy ship. This is the iconic warrior from World War II telling the American people in 1953 that giving too much money to the military establishment is tantamount to ending our democracy. And we are well at that. We are well at that process. I don't know how many of you saw Dana Priest's fine documentary on Frontline and have dug into it even further. Let me tell you, the old analogy about the tip of the iceberg, she didn't even get the seagull on the top of the tip of the iceberg. It is much worse than that in terms of top secret America. Much worse than 850,000 people with top secret clearances, all beavering away at huge taxpayer expense to do what? To do what? I cannot tell you in 31 years of serving in the Department of Defense that I ever got an actionable piece of intelligence from the Central Intelligence Agency one single time. In fact, we loathed and hated the Central Intelligence Agency. I'm deep into a book right now by Lieutenant Colonel Tony Schaefer, who was in Afghanistan, who was operating with the CIA, operating with the DIA, operating with SEAL Team 6, with the Rangers and so forth. And I think he held back. It's heavily redacted in places, but I think he held back. He could have said a lot more. The CIA is an expense that is virtually non-productive. Where are we dealing with this sort of thing? 17 entities we have now. Instead of doing something to trim it and make it more effective, what did we do? We created the DNI, and now that labyrinth is so huge that when I was there for a retirement ceremony the other day, I said, man, this is a huge place. What did it cost you, about $5 billion? And the woman looked at me and said, oh, you don't know anything. You don't know what's underground. It stretches between Tyson's Corner and its little spot there on the crossroads where I go to visit Colin Powell when I go in McLean. I mean, it's some of the most expensive real estate in the country. But that's not really what I came here to talk about. I came here to talk about the Iraq War. And I'm about out of time, so I guess I better get to it. As best as I can tell, what that $80 billion apparatus furnished for the President of the United States and for his cabinet was an intelligence picture that at best was flawed and at worst was a complete lie. Now, how do you spend that kind of money and get that kind of performance out of your intelligence apparatus? Well, it's easy if you have an intelligence apparatus that doesn't matter what it says really, because the policymakers are going to mold whatever it says to whatever it is that is their policy goal. And that's essentially what happened. And as far as I can tell, the DCI, the Director of Central Intelligence, the man who was the head of intelligence at that particular time, 16 entities at that point, about $60 billion worth, lied to the United States Secretary of State. I cannot see any other conclusion from both my own experience, intimate as it was, out in Langley for 6 days and 6 nights, with George Tenet and John McLaughlin as deputy, literally on my elbow most of the time. I either have to come to the conclusion that they were ordered to do it and did it like faithful, loyal soldiers, or I have to come to the conclusion that they were utterly incompetent, or I have to conclude that it was a little bit of all and some lying thrown in. And my experience with government tells me that latter conclusion is probably closer to the truth. How do you explain, for example, when Colin Powell comes into me furious, and Colin Powell didn't show his furor very much, and he says, come here, let's go into a space. Let's go in there and be alone. And I knew he was angry, and we go into the space and he closes the door. We were in the National Intelligence Council spaces that are separate from the CIA itself in the main building. And he said, I'm going to throw all this stuff about terrorism out. This was his presentation at the UN on 5 February 2003. I'm going to throw it all out. I said, good, I agree, it's bull. And then he looked at me and he smiled and he said, it's Genesis and Deuteronomy. So what do you mean by that? And he said, it's Muhammad begats Ismail, begats Osaphat, and so on and so on. It's nothing. It's just a historical lineage that somebody's built up to try and show that Baghdad has some contact with Al-Qaeda. It's insubstantial. Let's throw it out. So we're going to throw it out. Great. We're going to throw it out. That was going to be a huge pillar coming out of his presentation. Within an hour, George Tenet walks into the DCI's conference room, his conference room, Colin Powell there, Condi Rice, their National Security Advisor, Rich Armitage, Deputy Secretary of State, me and others. And Tenet says, we've just interrogated a high-level al-Qaeda operative, and he has just dumped a bombshell out. And that bombshell substantiates really hard contacts between al-Qaeda and Baghdad, the Mukhabarat, the secret police in Baghdad. In fact, it includes them training Iraqi operatives in how to use chemical and biological weapons. We didn't know, and we weren't told at the time, that the high-level al-Qaeda operative had been tortured. He'd been tortured in Cairo by the Egyptians. There were no U.S. personnel present when he was tortured and when he supposedly confessed. And we also were not told by the DCI, who was responsible to tell us that representing all the intelligence community, that the DIA, the Defense Intelligence Agency, had recanted, or not recanted, had dissented on that information about 14 days after they had read it. In other words, they said the high-level al-Qaeda operative was not reliable. We were also not told that the high-level al-Qaeda operative himself had recanted about a week after he had given this information and said that he gave it simply to get the torture to stop. With that information, Powell put the connection back into his presentation at the UN. And in my view, that was really the most powerful part of his presentation, because it convinced the American people, who were holding Colin Powell up in the polls at 60, 65, even 70% at that time, that there was a substantial connection between 9/11 and Saddam Hussein. In fact, as I travel across the country, there are still people out there who believe that that's the reason we're in Iraq, that there was a connection. There was no connection. This was clearly fabricated, and it was fabricated, in my view, supported by research that I've done afterwards and my own experience out at Langley. It was fabricated in the Defense Department, in a special plan shop under Douglas Feith, the #3 man in the Pentagon, Undersecretary of Defense for Policy, and it was shared with and passed back and forth with the Vice President's office. And so you had this relationship that actually plugged itself into several people out of the CIA too, who were spies for the Vice President, if you will, and kept the CIA on the right track. So that your money was used to pay for an intelligence community that crafted its policy, or crafted its intelligence to go around the policy that George W. Bush wanted to execute, which was in fact the invasion of Iraq in 2003. And everything that flowed out of that was detrimental to the interests of the United States of America. Everything that flowed out of that. Whether it was the increase in terrorist attacks that occurred because we had so many boots on the ground in the Middle East, whether it was because of the deaths that occurred, which were documented here or talked about here. I think the deaths in Iraq alone now are probably up conservatively to 250,000 or more. The deaths in Afghanistan, we don't talk about coalition and military deaths very often. There are a lot of young men and women who've been wounded horribly. All of this lies at the feet not of a strategic decision by your president, who consulted with your representatives and you in making it, to invade another country preemptively. No positive result that I can see has come out of this. Now there are those who will say, no, Afghanistan is calming down, Iraq's calmed down, so forth and so on. All I'll tell you is wait and see. Wait and see. What we do know is there's probably 200 to 300 billion barrels of oil in Iraq. That is to say, more than Saudi Arabia now. Maliki's government plans to be at 13 million barrels per day production capacity in 7 years. He won't make it, but for political reasons, not because he doesn't have the oil. But if that's the reason we went to Iraq, and if that's the reason that you would buy as an American citizen so you can continue to drive your SUVs and so forth, then you should have been consulted. You shouldn't have been told that it was all because of 9/11, it was all because of those tragic deaths in Pennsylvania and Washington and New York. You should have been told it was for 300 billion barrels of oil. You weren't. That's just the tip of the iceberg, ladies and gentlemen.